Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Thomas, and I am the Government Industry Manager. Joining me today is Simon Thompson, the Commercial Industry Manager, along with Katie Cliff, with Technical Marketing, all here in Redlands, California. We want to welcome you to today's live training seminar. A little overview of what we're going to cover today. In today's seminar, we're going to cover three topics. What is GIS? GIS in everyday life, and the benefits of GIS. Each topic will be followed by a software demonstration, a quick review. At that time, we'll also ask you to break into a question and answer session with us by submitting questions. Send your questions at any time by clicking the link at the top left of your presentation window. So again, what we're going to be covering is what is GIS, GIS in everyday life, and the benefits of GIS. What we're hoping you get from the seminar or the session really is an executive or management view of geographic information systems. We hope that you leave with an idea of what GIS can do for an entire organization, or if you're an individual who works with executives, a better understanding of how to communicate with these individuals. So let's get right into the topic at hand. What is a GIS? Well, I kind of take a look at a chapter from a book. If we look at this, there's the formal definition of a GIS. And we'll read along. An organized collection of computer hardware, software, geographic data, and personnel designed to effectively capture, store, manipulate, analyze, and display all forms of geographically referenced information. Now, I've been doing GIS for a long time, and I still don't believe I understand what this means. And if you think about it, a lot of other people wouldn't understand what this means from a perspective of what is a GIS. And I ask you to kind of look at GIS and look at a definition of what GIS means to you and what GIS means to the individual who would either interact with it or to eventually use it. Another way is to start looking at redefining your view of what GIS is and what GIS does. In a traditional sense, GIS does a lot of maps and visualization. But an overarching theme within GIS is the idea of organizing geographic data. More recently, GIS professionals have begun to look at the idea of workflow and decision models, how GIS is applied to the way you do your work. So oftentimes I like to use examples of what a GIS is by taking it into a different context. So I often tell people that they carry around a GIS database in their purse or their wallet each and every day. You may not have thought of it that way. So I like to use a driver's license as an example. Now, I'm going to do a little comparison here between the GIS world and the traditional IS world or information systems world. In the IS world, we all tend to use things like customer numbers, account numbers. I think I memorized my social security number by going through college. But let's take a look at the driver's license as the example. So let's look at it. What's the first thing you see on a driver's license? The driver's license number. That would be equivalent to the IT tag. Now, what's the second line? Your name. My name's Chris Thomas. While I think that's unique, there are many people across the world with the name Chris Thomas. So that's not an identifier. And the driver's license number might be unique just to that system. But what's the third line? Well, it's your situs address. A geography reference. What's the next one? Your city, followed by your state, followed by your zip code. If you stop and think about it for just a moment, what are the first three digits of a phone number? An area code. In GIS, we believe that we can latch onto different data sets by its geography and mix and match those data sets. So taking this driver's license example, I'd ask you to kind of keep this in the back of your mind as we progress through this session. The next thing you should understand is how to explain what GIS is to other people and what it means to you. Have you ever thought about describing GIS as a vehicle from which to generate revenue, a revenue auditing system? Have you ever described GIS as a way of increasing efficiency or building an information base? Have you ever described GIS to somebody as a tool for workflow and productivity? Well, let me illustrate this point. And oftentimes I think it's best to draw from personal experience. I was a GIS manager for a number of years, and I was working for a jurisdiction in times much like these, where revenues were questionable and there was a down economy. In a staff meeting, much like many of you participate in, we were sitting around the table trying to figure out how we could support the revenue stream in the city. And in that meeting was the Director of Administrative Services, myself from GIS IT, and our business license manager. Now, in our first meeting, the business license manager thought that he would use GIS in a very meaningful way to find out unlicensed revenues. His thought was that the GIS division could create a map. Now, that's a pretty obvious output from a GIS, and it's what most people think about. And his thought was that we could produce a map that would have all the various commercial uses in it, drawing from the land use file, which told us where there were apartment complexes and residential units and businesses and even vacant land. And his theory was that he could use the GIS to give the map to his inspectors who could drive the city, and the map would actually save them time by not driving the entire 40 square mile area, but only focus on those areas of the city that actually would have businesses. Now, that in itself would have been a great tool for the GIS and would have some obvious benefits. But let's go back to my driver's license example and work into the next phase of this. What I told the business license manager is, what if we created an application using the GIS where we never produced a map and we never left the building to do this audit? What I said to him was, why don't you pull up your GIS database? He said, I don't have one. I said, sure you do. Pull up your business license file. He did so. So what's the first line in the business license file? Business license number, driver's license number. What's the second line? Business name, your name. What's the third line? The situs address, the city, the state, the zip code, and the phone number. He had a geographically referenced database that could be consumed within the GIS. Well, what we did is we took the business license file in one department and we compared that to the land use file in the planning department. And we basically did a comparison by allowing the GIS to mix the databases together. The planning file was identified by parcel number or lot ID and had the land uses associated with it. Well, in a test area, we spent 16 man-hours and recovered $156,000 in lost revenue, pretty much what we were hoping to achieve. And that was $156,000 that wasn't a one-time gain. It was a gain for each year that business was in business. Well, we took this a little step further. We showed this results at a larger staff meeting because we were excited about the prospect of using GIS for this application. In that meeting, one of the department heads suggested that we were probably sending notices out to vacant buildings. And we kind of thought about it for a moment and we decided he was probably right. So we said, how do we fix this? Well, there was another GIS database in the city. It was the water utility billing system. And in that system was the same nomenclature: customer number, customer name, address. So what we did is we took the three different files and used the GIS to connect those three files with different geographies. And we compared the water master file, which had things like irrigation that showed us that the water was on or off, it was being used for landscape, versus going into a building for personal consumption. Compared that to the land use file and compared that back to the business license file. Well, the results were pretty phenomenal. We had spent about a total of 32 man-hours on the entire project from beginning to end. We recovered $256,000 in lost revenue. Now, as a result of most GIS products, what we have is a benefit to another department. In this case, because the individual identified that we were probably sending notices to vacant buildings, we ended up with a data file of vacant buildings, which we were able to pass on to the Economic Development Department, who could put that out onto the web to promote sites available for new businesses to come in, which meant jobs and other revenues to the jurisdiction. Now, I want to remind you, never once was there a map created from this project. It was a series of mailing labels and letters that went directly to the residents of those buildings. So when you look at the GIS, you start thinking about enterprise or organization-wide applications. The knowledge or the idea of leveraging one discipline and one data set into another. The idea here is that manufacturing may be able to use the data and the knowledge derived from distribution, which could be shared with advertising or the business services unit. all to be consumed within a strategic planning effort. In other words, the databases and the knowledge that's created in one area has geographic references and can be used and leveraged by others. Now, let's step back for a moment and take a look at the definitions of GIS in a different perspective. Now, if I start at the top, GIS is really, really good for mapping and reporting. But what did we describe as a result of doing GIS was the process of data creation. We performed analysis. What we had as a result was a data center that could be shared by other organizations and other individuals. GIS is great for mobile workforce. Whether you're a sales territory person that's trying to take GIS in the field to optimize their day, or a building inspector who's taking GIS out in the field to take results of what they're finding in their day-to-day activities. GIS is a wonderful visualization tool. And finally, whether using the internet or intranet, is a great data access tool, and it's terrific for things like customer portals and citizen access portals. So we're going to step in for a moment and talk about implementing a GIS. Now, obviously, GIS requires software and hardware. And you got to have some idea of what the types of applications you're going to develop over time will be. And we're going to need some training. But I always remind people that the most important components of a GIS are the data itself, whether you create it or you leverage the data within an organization, understanding what type of GIS data you actually have or need to create. The other piece is the staff. Staff is the most important component. Whether you're a GIS professional or a professional that uses GIS, you need a staff that understands how to ask spatial questions and how to link data together from a geographic viewpoint. So we've got this idea of what it's going to take to put the GIS together, so we want to get started. And so what I always tell people is that what they want to do is start to build a solid foundation, to build the data layers that everybody can use. Oftentimes, a GIS is started with one project in mind, and they will get to the others as they move forward. But in the case that I shared with you on the business license audit, we needed only a handful of GIS databases. We really needed a street file, a parcel file, the water meter file, and we needed the ability for GIS to interact with it. So if I looked at a government context, a municipal setting, which I'm most familiar with, I could go to the law enforcement department and say, what would you need to do your work? And again, asking the question, what do you do for a living? Well, they might need streets for routing or to place tickets. They might need territories. They may need routes. If I go to the planning department, they too may need streets. They may need demographic information, zoning, or land use. But if I went over to the public works department, what would I find there? I might find the same foundation data sets. They would start with streets. They may need land ownership or asset management. They may not need the same data the others. So how do you start? You start by building the streets. Now, to the right, you see this idea of the data being stacked on top of each other. We call that layering. I'll bet there's a lot of you out there that can remember encyclopedias when they came in book format. My favorite volume of the encyclopedia was always the human body section. And if you remember, they had the human body and had the clear acetates, and you could peel back the acetates and you could see the skeletal system, the circulatory system, or the muscular system. And if you put them together, you could see how they fit, and as you peeled them back, you could see more detail. GIS is much like that. It's an ability to mix and match data sets and to see how they interrelate to one another. The next thing to think about is what data is fair game in a GIS? What do we mean by all data is geographically able to be referenced and consumed within a GIS? Again, a GIS person believes that every database has an ability to be consumed within a GIS based on a geographic tag. So if I look to the bottom left, we look at a tabular database. This could be a spreadsheet or a DBMS. And what we're tapping into is the address or the geographies within those columns. If I think about something like GPS up to the top, I can collect things like lat long, XY coordinates, so that I can find the physical locations in the real world and put them back into a GIS. But if I look to the top right, I start to realize that imagery, photo, terrain, even a scanned image of a document can be put into place. Consider, if you will, you have a deed, and in that deed it has the legal description of the property, the address, or perhaps even a more discrete database description of that property. All of these would be fair game within a GIS. If you think about it, even that camera that sits on top of a traffic signal is in of itself a geographic location capturing data in the form of photos. That too could be read into a GIS. Now, I kind of described the process of understanding the applications and understanding how to set your foundations and how to begin thinking spatially. I oftentimes try to get people to think about implementing GIS as an application portfolio. Think about your own investment habits. You have a checking account. You don't expect a lot of return on investment there. You might get a little bit of interest, but it's for the most part of doing day-to-day activity and paying bills. I might have a retirement account that grows slowly over time and has a long-term benefit. And yet I might have bonds or other savings accounts that deliver even a diff type of investment. GIS is much the same. If I take the business license audit as an example, I didn't spend a lot of time. I was able to leverage the existing data, and the return was significant. But if I looked at something like a sewer master plan or a long-range plan, I might take months or years. I might have to create data on demand or on the fly. I might have to interact with other departments and disciplines. It will have a long-term benefit for the community, but its payback will take longer. What you want to do is get those foundation data sets out and allow for the different jurisdictions and different disciplines to be able to use that. So if you think about GIS in the context of what we looked at technology when it first came out, if somebody said to you, hey, what would you do with a computer? Your answer could be lots of things, and that's enough to get into it. But it's how you actually implement it as you go through that makes a difference. So what I always tell people is that when you look at building data and you look at building a GIS, I always start from the premises of what does the person you're supporting do for a living? Not what could that person do if they had a GIS. So data development needs to meet the business needs. If you always start from the foundation of supporting existing activities, you'll always have a lot better use and expansion of the GIS over time. Let's put this into a different context. Where does GIS fit? Well, if I look at the starting boxes, GIS would not start the asset management process. You may already do routes for sales territory analysis or distribution or routing a fire or a trash truck. You might already be involved in a planning process. GIS does not start these activities. So where does GIS fit? Well, GIS might be used to track and inventory the asset. It may be used to generate the routes. It may be used to do suitability analysis and to do modeling of a land use. It's in the output. I might produce a map. I might produce an internet portal where citizens can take a look at routing themselves around activities, or it might produce a letter or a report. I think it's even more fun sometimes to take a look and putting GIS in a completely different context so that you can think about it in different ways and then relate it back to your work. So I'm going to ask you to think as if you were asked by a city council to be part of a citizen planning committee to design some new city parks. And as you would suspect, the staff has decided to give maps of the city to the citizens to begin making their decisions. Now, staff is kind of giving you some criteria. They've told you that the site will have a need to be fairly large. It would have soccer fields, basketball courts, perhaps some swimming pools and some areas for the kids to play. Now, do you have a parcel that you're starting to hone in that might be a valuable location? I bet you do. But here's where GIS begins to be different in its ability to support decisions. What if I just told you that this is that exact same data set laid over imagery and terrain data? Do you think now that your decision might be a little bit different? Is there infrastructure or roads that can get here? It looked like there was a lot of smaller parcels, but now I can see they're further away. To further illustrate this, I've asked Katie to put together a demo that will show you what this would look like in a GIS system. Katie?
Thanks, Chris. So here we're looking at a free geo-browser application called ArcGIS Explorer. Now it might look a little funny because our streaming technology limits our refresh, but I do think it helps to illustrate Chris's point well. So what we see here is some base map imagery as well as some transportation infrastructure. Now, as a member of the park planning committee, I'm going to need to bring in additional layers to help make a better decision. So first I bring in the full city park layer. But as Chris mentioned, what we're interested in are large city-owned parcels. So we can bring those in, and those are shown in green. Now, if you see up here in the north, this parcel looks like it's quite large and may accommodate our soccer fields and our basketball courts and our swimming pools, so we'll mark that as a potential location. However, when we zoom in and get a 3D perspective on this view, we see that the terrain might not actually support our requirements. So again, bringing all of these questions into the context of geography helps us to make more informed decisions. Chris, back to you.
So with that software demonstration, what we saw was the ability to add three-dimensional GIS and to add a different dimension to your thought process. We've reached a spot in our presentation where we'll do a little review here. So we've covered what is GIS, and hopefully we've left with a kind of an idea of a different way of thinking about GIS and a different way of applying it. We've kind of covered the idea of what it takes to get into GIS and how to get your staff and your data sets organized. We've all asked you to leverage the data that exists and combine it with data that needs to be created. So we're ready for our first questions, and we'll remind you to keep those questions coming in. I'll turn it over to Simon to answer a few of these.
All right, thanks, Chris. Actually, we have a question here on data from Carrie in Waco. And she says, so much of the cost of GIS has always been around data. From what I've learned, more than 50% of the costs. How true is that today? So, Carrie, I think there's a number of ways in which this is changing. Traditionally, it was very hard to capture background information. Typically, departments were capturing a lot of their asset information. And think about the history of GIS, it came really from asset-intensive business areas, such as government, utilities, defense. But now more and more, there's lots of data available for free or through public and consumer areas. We're all familiar with Google, with Microsoft Virtual Earth, with MapQuest, and all of those things. And a lot of that can provide you the background information that you may need. In fact, ESRI provides standard APIs and capabilities to reading all of that information. A lot of ESRI's customers support services, web services that provide information that can be consumed by all of our products. And where Katie showed ArcGIS Explorer, that will consume a lot of this information as well. ESRI itself has taken on an initiative called ArcGIS Online to provide background mapping for a lot of the work that we do. And we'll actually show some of this in other applications and demonstrations throughout the seminar. So ultimately, the cost of managing and maintaining data is very much going down. And there's also a lot of federation. So I'd encourage you to go out and find people who can actually provide you information. Question from John in Honolulu says, I understand that GIS is now becoming part of the enterprise. Can you tell me more about this? So John, I think this is really true of where we're moving from. You know, GIS traditionally has been thought of as a desktop type application, but everything we'll show you is about providing information to the people that need it, to analysts, to decision makers, from people that actually need to take this information into the field. And often it's very easy to do this. So at ESRI, we're really focused on trying to capture the expertise and domain knowledge of people and publish that through this paradigm that we always describe, author, serve, use. So taking information out, using a geographic approach, publishing that through ArcGIS Server, ArcGIS Online, or some of our other products, and providing it to people who actually can use it to make decisions. And this could be anybody. This could be police in the field, homeland security people, utility and asset managers, again, out in the field doing this. And people are no longer tied to their desks to do GIS. And in fact, coming up, Chris will describe some of those areas. So Chris, why don't you take it on from here?
Thanks, Simon. Again, keep your questions coming in and we'll answer them as we proceed. So from a manager perspective, I think it's sometimes best to put GIS in the context of everyday life. And I would challenge you that you probably interact with GIS on a day-to-day basis and probably aren't even realizing it. You ever think about that TV commercial we've all seen where the individual's on his cell phone and he takes a couple steps forward and he says, "Can you hear me now?" He takes a couple more steps forward and says, "Can you hear me now?" What's that individual doing? that individual is collecting geographically referenced information about the quality of the signal to that cell phone for future planning. Did you ever think about him in the context of collecting geographic information systems data? So taking a look at that, I look at the different systems that people are putting in place. And the idea here is GIS is an integrated system. It's a complementary system to a lot of things that you're putting in the traditional IT sense. It's the systems that you're developing. So we find that a lot of organizations are developing customer relationship management systems. We see things like business intelligence, where information at the readiness for intelligent business decisions. We see things like work order management systems and ERP or enterprise resource planning. From a government context, we see things like permitting. Now, in the old days, we used to have permitting. And the idea was, I have a permit for a new building or what have you. And they said the connection to GIS was, here's the permit. Now here's a dot on a map to show you where that permit is. But when you stop and think about it, GIS is really a tool to set the foundation. So what do we have here? Well, if I wanted to not start from scratch and have only new permits, I might want to have a foundation data set that said, okay, a permit's going to be applied here. Where is it? Well, in that case, all the data, the deeds we talked about, all the scan images, the photos related to sites, all the past history, and the addresses and street locations could be put into a permitting system to present the foundation from which to build that permitting on. Now, GIS becomes a vehicle to query the permitting system. I can ask the question, what are all the permits at this location, this situs address? I could ask the question, could you show me all the permits associated along this street segment and get back the history of that? So at that point, GIS becomes a complement and a support to a GIS. Another idea that we have is the executive dashboard. This is becoming fairly commonplace with management. The idea here is that you have a map interface combined with other data sets. Now, this may represent a national sales territory. It might be a fleet manager of a nationwide fleet site. It might be a local jurisdiction who's looking at their work orders in respect to day-to-day activities. The idea here is that you can see where your resources and the activities on the map and identify and pull up pertinent information. I can see whether or not there are complaints. Are we on schedule? How much is the cost associated with this activity? And deploy and reallocate resources based on things as you see them. What happens here is just becomes part of an interactive decision making so that you can make decisions on the fly. I think it's really fun a lot of times to think about how we interact with GIS in a day-to-day relationship from a consumer standpoint. For those in the United States, you might be a member of the AAA Club, the Automobile Association of America. And so when you go on their online site and you're looking for things like a trip tip for your vacation or driving directions or points of interest to visit, behind that is a GIS system. For those of you who carry map books in your car, I always think about that in a context that some of those maps are produced with the GIS as part of their output. Now, as consumers or as citizens, we might visit government web pages where we might find the nearest location of county or city services, what's around it, bus stops. That is being driven by a GIS system. You might have an on-site store locator that types in your area code or zip code and produces the results of the nearest stores and the driving directions to them. It may be the closest ATM machine. That is driven by GIS and analysis behind the scenes. Now, in business, GIS is being used extensively in customer analytics. It might be used to understand buying patterns, to profile your customers, looking at what customers are willing to drive longer distance. It's used in advertising to target advertising and to understand the reach that you might be realizing. It's used for sales territory management, for store locators and optimizing sales calls. Now, the media is an exciting area to me personally. Now, as we come into the election period, we'll recall at the last major election how television stations like CBS News were using GIS. We all recall the definition of the red state versus blue state geography. And what was happening behind the scenes was that analysis, as the detail was coming in, was being projected and visualized through a GIS system. I would venture to guess that we'd see a lot of it this go around. GIS can also be used by the media, by newspapers. When I take a look at the map in a newspaper that might have been used for investigative reporting and to present back the material to the readers. It might be used to do a customized application where I might want to have a specific language or a specific geography edition of a newspaper or maybe even a magazine. And I can customize the advertisements based on that profile. It's used on online news media. In the California fires, we had GIS linked to RSS feeds and updated information on articles and things like shelters so that people could come in and learn where things were coming from. I challenge you to look at your favorite crime show on television, and I'll bet at some point you'll always see something that looks like a GIS doing some analysis for the investigators. GIS has been used in government for years. It's been used for land use planning and zoning analysis. It's used by your public works and law enforcement to do things like planning and asset management. Now, in emergency management, you realize and interact with GIS on a regular basis. When you call a 911 call, when you're distressed, a GIS is behind the scenes. It shows you where you are and where the distressed person is, whether it's on a cell phone or it's a physical location. It's tapping into geography. It tells you the closest responding vehicles and the best routes to get there and allows for the public safety personnel to route themselves around closed roads. It's used in education. It might be used to do long-range planning to place new schools. It's used for bus routing and to understand where to put bus stops in relationship to populations. It's used to do things like school district attendance boundaries. Now, not-for-profits are no strangers to the use of GIS as well. You might find GIS in use in 4-H clubs for educational purposes to reach out to the community. Red Cross is no stranger to GIS in disasters. They use GIS to figure out the different resources and to where to stage their events. It may range from where do people have pets and how do I do pet rescues versus where do I have specific populations like elderly that might need different types of resources, or it might be a language barrier. It helps them mobilize. A thing that's come up and has started to crop up in the not-for-profit interaction with governments and other entities is this idea of an incident command post that uses the common operating picture. GIS gives a frame of reference. People know where it is and they can start to pull the other data in once they have a context. Facilities management or building management is another growing area for GIS use. Now, if you think back to my example of the human body acetates, a building is not much more than a confined geography. Those layers could be floors or cubicles. It could be used for maximizing building use, to understand how to place work orders or CRMs within that system. It could be used for lease and retail management. If you think about a situation, think about the shootings that happen on school campuses, like the Columbine incident. A campus could be mapped out. You could know which school classrooms are in use. How many students are in that classroom? Where are the gates? Where are the emergency exits? Where is the telephone in relationship to the room that an individual might be in, and how many students were in there? As you can start to think about it, GIS in the use of facilities or building management has unlimited applications as well. GIS has always been used by utilities such as gas, electric, water, and various other utilities. It's used for things like asset management, incident reporting, complaint tracking, design. You'll find GIS in many utilities across the world. So we thought we'd take a moment here and do a software demonstration. I'm going to turn it over to Simon, who's going to show you Business Analyst Online.
Okay, this actually has been designed to present a common question that we always have with our business and commercial industries is, how can GIS actually be used by small businesses? Matulika in Herndon actually asked this question of me today. Actually said, how do I as a small business take GIS or implement GIS? So we built Business Analyst Online to address this very need. We've got thousands of small businesses using this, up to large multinational companies, economic developers, healthcare, utilities, telecoms, a wide range of large businesses, public utilities, public organization, and government bodies. And the reason it's so popular is because it presents information in a very easy to use way. We built the demographic information. We have retail market potential. We have information about expenditure, consumer behavior, and we've grouped this all together essentially under this idea of software as a service. You can come in, have an annual subscription, purchase a day pass, or get access to free reports that ESRI publish as a guest user. So let's think about this scenario. I'm an economic developer, and I'm actually going to try and pitch or market a piece of land, and we're going to choose the ESRI campus as part of that. As a new user, I've actually got access to a video that teaches me how to use this system. I don't need to learn to use the system. I can actually be guided through this. And this is a common part of what ESRI is trying to do to make GIS more accessible to managers and executives and business professionals who are not familiar with the technology, and also for people who do not want to install software on their desktop. So I type in the address. I use all the familiar find information that you see in consumer mapping applications like Microsoft and Google, MapQuest, and all those other products we're familiar with. I automatically get an area where I'm zoomed into this space. We can see our offices highlighted here by a pushpin. And this piece of land that I'm going to develop is actually adjacent to this. If we look at the aerial imagery, I can see that around here we have not only the freeway, but a large area in which I have commercial buildings, offices, warehousing, industrial areas. Well, that's going to impact the type of land that I actually want to develop and the businesses that I can attract. Of course, I can supplement this with other types of imagery, other types of data. And many of you will be asking, well, why is this any different from the sort of things that you've already described, like Microsoft or Google? Well, I think the key thing here is the other tools and the analysis that we provide. We have a team with a large amount of expertise and domain knowledge who've published this information and made the access to spatial analysis very easy. So here we have a little interactive tool where we're actually publishing information that we have, in this case, household information, household income. We've colored it up using an interactive tool from hot to cold. We're looking at it across different geographies and different geographic scales. So here at census tract level, I can see that to the south, I have income between $55,000 and $66,000 per year. But to the north, in the area that the campus is inside, the income is only $33,000 to $44,000. But I know this area, this seems a little low. So what's actually going on? If I zoom out to a different scale, I can use that same thematic tool with this heat map to actually look at some of the other variations. So to the south, I have an area of income around $100,000. I have a much wider variation around this, but it still probably isn't detailed enough for me to make some really good decisions, and I know I need more. Now, if I zoom down to block group level for this mapping, I actually start to see we have considerable variation. I have salt and pepper. I have lots of areas of variation, and those big, broad brush strokes are actually being supplemented with much finer detail. And there's an area of interest to me. We've got one area with over $100,000 of income on average, and another area with less than $20,000, and these are adjacent. Maybe that's new development, maybe that's new properties, maybe that's an area which is a gated community, the type of audience I'm trying to reach. And again, around my campus, I see that those low numbers are actually not really a reflection of what's happening at the block level or the residential tract level. So we provide ways for you to actually evaluate and investigate this. I can upload a site by address, draw a hand-drawn shape, load them from a standard report like Excel or other Office products, or actually use standard geographies, any of those 9 geographies that we've described. In this case, I'm going to use my address, and I'm actually going to do some, again, quite complex spatial analysis. Driving distance, or it could be time, and I'm going to actually drive around and say, let me do 2, 5, and 10 minutes around this area and understand the geography as part of that. I now get my results. The red is the 2 minutes, the blue is the 10 minutes, and we can see the variation, and pretty significant variation in the shape of this catchment, this territory. Along the freeway, going east-west, we have it dragged out, goes to the north up the 30 to 330, and these finger-like approaches. But there's an area associated with the river and a major airport, which blocks me and stops me actually being able to drive there. It's actually a natural barrier associated with that. And these types of features are actually going to impact me when I do my analysis, and they impact my results. Here's where I've packaged up a lot of reports in simple and easy to use ways, associated with the different type of analysis you want to do, say businesses, demographic reports, lifestyle information, crime, traffic. So I'm going to choose here to do demographic analysis, further information about my income, which I can actually derive and download either as PDFs or Excel spreadsheets where I can go and do further analysis myself and maybe mix them into other systems. So let's look at this area we're interested in. Within 2 minutes, I actually have very low population, less than 700 people. And one interesting thing about this area is that I have almost 3 times as many renters as I do homeowners. And in 2000, about 60% of the people in this area were earning less than $35,000 per year. But that's forecast to change by 2012. So in this case now, only 43% will have that. I can summarize this in easy to understand graphs, the sort of information that Chris presented in these dashboards. And a lot of this is available as web services for you to actually mix in executive dashboards and other enterprise systems. Looking at the 5-mile area, or the 5-minute area, I should say, we now have a significant change in population. Population's around 40,000 in 2007, and the average household size has gone up from just under 2 to over 2.5 people per household. What does that mean? Well, it means I'm probably moving out of areas which are solely occupied by renters and into areas which are more occupied by young families, people starting homes. And equally associated with that, within 5 minutes, the forecast is that only 30% of the population will have less than $35,000 of income. So some pretty significant changes to my demography. And ESRI has tried to help you understand that. We have a system called Tapestry, which is a segmentation system that contains information about people's location, their lifestyle, and their life stage. It actually predicts how people will behave, what they'll do, what they buy, what interests they have, and the frequency and recency at which they use things. So it's associated with economic potential and purchasing power as well. And here is my map, which shows my dominant Tapestry codes. To the north, I can actually see that the people associated with this are actually what we call in style, people that have actually moved to the mountains as a lifestyle choice. Around our campus immediately, we have a group of people we would describe as old and newcomers. So people who've moved into rented property because of a life decision. And now it's obvious to me this is actually associated with condominiums and other rented apartments because the university is very close and people can move here to seek new jobs. So let's do some more analysis here. Now I need to understand how I can attract retailers in this case. I might want to develop this land in a particular way. Most of these people want to have reports in 1, 2, and 3 mile rings and understand the demography and the information we've just looked at. So here are those rings, and I can see the separation between Redlands on the east and San Bernardino to the west, and the large areas of urban and rural land in between. I can actually go and get a business summary report and understand this further. So associated with my businesses now, within 1 mile, I have about 14,000 people that are employed, about 13,000 residents. Associated with that is a high amount of food, eating away from home. 105 businesses, or about 10% of the total people that are employed. So perhaps it wouldn't be good to try and attract a quick service restaurant. Maybe I should do something else, a specialized business or a service agency, because within 2 miles, I have 26,000 people that are employed and 45,000 people that live here permanently. So I actually have a market of close to 75,000 people living within 2 miles of this location. And I'm pretty well defined in terms of understanding my demographics and the market potential associated with that. So Chris, back to you.
So we've gotten to a point where we're going to review a little bit here. So if you think about it, you engage with GIS and day-to-day activities in your own personal life, whether you're interacting with government or education, when you're dealing with commercial outlets like realtors and retail and banking, not-for-profits, organizations that use GIS can do a lot of different analysis and begin to use the tool to solve their problems. A way to think of GIS is not to think of GIS as implementing the GIS, but as a way of solving the problems that are facing. A manager needs to know how to fix what needs to be fixed or keep the operations maintained. We've hit a point where we're going to take a couple of questions, so I'm going to pass it back to Simon to take a few of those.
All right, thanks, Chris. So our demo's generated some interest here, and Max in Toronto says there was a series of excellent books called GIS Means Business, and they're out of print now. Does ESRI plan to renew and publish in an updated version? Well, actually, we are. We're working on that as we speak. We've just released a book for GIS for marketing. We're working on a new series of books which actually will describe the use of GIS for businesses that go right the way through a small business up to a large multinational. And our anticipation is we'll have that book out for 2009. In addition, there's a number of other resources which Chris will describe later on during this seminar. Mohammed in Dubai says, sometimes the higher managers in organization are not aware of the importance of GIS. How can we as GIS managers get their support for implementing GIS projects which are too costly? So Mohammed, I think one of the issues we need to deal with is what is the cost versus return. ESRI has been working very heavily on demonstrating the value and benefits of GIS. And at the user conference in August in San Diego, we'll actually present a number of seminars on GIS and ROI. So how do I calculate return on investment? ESRI will release a book through ESRI Press that actually will give you a methodology for calculating return on investment, and actually provides conversation pathways and tools and standardized templates that you as GIS managers can use to actually get involved and go through the people that are controlling the purse strings and demonstrate the value of GIS. And that's also supported by a large number of case studies. I'd encourage everybody who wants to work with their managers to go to the showcase, esri.com/showcase, and look at the resources which are available there. Case studies, best practices, a whole range of information across different industries.
So thanks, Simon. So we're going to move forward into the final segment of this presentation and talk about the benefits of a GIS. This is where you can really understand the value of this tool. When you're looking at maximizing the benefits, you have to really realize that the descriptions that we have presented are really about organization-wide implementation that allows for people to leverage disciplines and databases as a means of having the most maximum yield or benefit. Now, we're going to cover a couple of case studies as we move forward. And in some cases, a manager might be more interested in time savings or saving money or increased productivity. But as we go through these processes of showing you the case studies, what you need to know is that while we'll focus on one benefit, most times, just like my revenue auditing story, there was benefits that were extended to other departments that the GIS application was not intended for. That's one of the beauties of GIS, is that every time you turn around, you find another application for it to benefit an organization from a return on investment standpoint. So with that, let's get into a couple case studies. I'm going to share with you 3 of them, and I'm going to start off with the County of Sacramento, California. Now, I'll ask you as a citizen driving around the streets, have you ever scratched your head and wondered why the same street keeps getting excavated, dug up, and then repaved over and over again? Well, you know, that's a problem that almost everybody goes through, and Sacramento was much in the same situation. But they began to take a look at what was causing this, and they implemented a product or project called Saco, the street excavation in right-of-way application. Now, what they realized was that one of the reasons that the street was being dug up over and over and over again and being repaved is that there were different entities who didn't have a relationship with one another were working in the same area. So, for example, a public utility might be going through, such as a gas company or a water company or maybe an electric utility, doing an expansion. And they needed to dig up the streets and to put the new utilities underground. Now, what they didn't know was another department was going to come through, dig up the same street, and do repairs or maybe do some adjustments to upgrades to existing infrastructure. In other words, they were working on projects that were part of their day-to-day work activity, but they just weren't aware of each other. Well, when you look at this, what they did is a very simple on-demand look at what activity, project coordination, ERP, work order management system that could be looked at in a single interface. So what are the benefits of this? Well, in Sacramento County, what they calculated was that if they just saved a cul-de-sac from being dug up over and over again, one time basically, that each savings would equate to $20,000 in expenditures, a cost avoidance, if you will. Now, the other thing this application did is improve communication between different organizations and entities. It also improved communications to various departments and other services, such as emergency personnel and ambulance services. They were able to take a look at where excavation would be taking place, and they could reroute their activities. Much so, the departments such as the trash collection and the law enforcement could know how to reroute themselves and reallocate their day service. And again, that's citizen benefits, that they can know that their travel to a store or to work is going to be disrupted, and they can make alternative plans. I'll move on to the city of Saco, Maine. Now, Saco, Maine was a fairly small jurisdiction when we started this case study. And like all the jurisdictions in the United States, they were required to meet the requirements of a federal mandate called GASB 34. It's an accounting standard. And what it does is it makes sure that an organization understands its infrastructure and inventory that infrastructure. It also requires that an organization show that it's maintaining that infrastructure. So how did Saco do this work and produce a GIS-based system to solve this problem? Well, simply stated, they developed a GIS-based asset inventory and fiscal planning process. What they were able to do is take and develop a specific item-by-item inventory of assets that could include roads and bridges, light poles, manhole covers, signals, any type of infrastructure. It could have with it the photos and the supporting documents that went along with it. Now, they could have had an alternative use, which was acceptable. They could have taken, say, all the roads in an organization or a jurisdiction and say, okay, I have this much road, and here's how I'm going to depreciate it based on depreciation schedules and maintenance schedules. But what they opted to do was an itemized asset inventory within a GIS system. Well, what were the benefits of doing the alternative? Well, for starters, they saved their jurisdiction $2 million over a 20-year period. Again, their bond rating was rated by two bond rating houses by 2 points. This allowed for them to go out and build new infrastructure and to float bonds to pay for that infrastructure. Keep in mind that a component of GASB 34 revolved around citizens not being asked to pay for infrastructure when a jurisdiction didn't have a handle on what it is they currently had in inventory and could or could not prove that they were maintaining it. In this case, Saco was able to do that. For my final example, I'll turn it to the insurance industry. I'll describe to you Royal and Sun Alliance. Now, here was what their problem was. They witnessed the largest oil depot explosion in Europe since World War II. So what happens in this type of situation? You immediately go into, what is our risk? How much will this cost? Well, in this particular situation, they put a GIS in place that allowed them to understand the explosion, what types of homes and businesses were affected, what type of infrastructure would be needed to be replaced. In essence, they needed to know how much they were going to pay in claims and how hard it was going to be to get the community back up and running. In this particular case, they were able to take a look and calculate the expenditures of claims within 10% of the actual loss. They are also able to use the GIS to mobilize resources to help people that had claims to get the community back up and running. So we thought we'd start with an area here that might be in a lot of people's minds, so something you could do with GIS tomorrow. We've all got this idea of global warming and reduced carbon footprints. Gas prices have us all concerned about the bottom line, and we want to increase our productivity and efficiency at the same time. This and is a logistics or a routing problem, and GIS solves that. Much like the drive time analysis, this is applied to fleets. So I've asked Katie to show a demonstration of how routing could be applied to this problem.
Thanks, Chris. So I'm in charge of dispatching crews for my organization. Now, to solve this problem, I'm going to use a web browser application to bring together some of my GIS layers. So one of those GIS layers is actually my service calls. Now, this comes to me as an Excel spreadsheet, and I have information about the address of the service call, city, state, zip code, as well as the service time, how long my driver is going to have to spend at that call, and the time window between what time can they arrive at that particular stop to service. So we'll bring that location onto the service call locations onto our base map. Now, I also know the locations of 3 depots from which my drivers need to start and end their day. Now, for a long time, we've been doing zone routing, or service territories, if you will. So 1 driver per each zone or service territory. And last but not least, we're going to bring in some dynamic information such as traffic, planned construction, or accidents, because this ends up decreasing the productivity of my drivers, so I want to avoid those if possible. Now, what we've done is we've created a solution that shows the optimized turn-by-turn directions for each of these zone routing solutions. Now, if I review a cost report, I can see that for my crews to service 60 stops by zone, it's going to cost my organization about $2,300. Now, if we expand to see the details, we can see information about each of the individual routes. So Route 1 is going to cost $128 and service about 4 stops. Now, 4 stops really isn't that many, so what we want to do is see if we can further optimize that, use the software to further optimize that. So now what we're going to do is submit a request to the server. This time we're going to say, still avoid the traffic situation, but we're no longer required to follow zone routing. So we'll see if we can get a better solution. Now, this is really important to me given that we have huge incentives to save on fuel.
So Katie, just looking at this is obviously a mashup here. You've got data from different sources. Can you go in a bit more detail about where this is all coming from?
Excellent point, Simon. So what I've done is I've brought in base map information from ArcGIS Online. And this was really nice for me because I didn't have to worry about what the base map looked like. I could concentrate on bringing in my own GIS layers on top of that to solve my problem.
Okay, that's great. And there's dynamic routes and things, accidents, planned construction. Is that RSS? What's happening there?
So there are traffic feeds from Yahoo or other organizations that actually manage that information as a business so that we can pull in dynamically to our route and take into account for our solution. So now let's review the results of this application. What we can see as we hover over each of these, I have a cost report that allows us to compare. So the total, again, the same 60 stops that we're servicing. We're not doing zone routing this time. And again, this is going to cost us about $1,500 as compared to the $2,300 that I showed you before. So again, if we expand the details on this, we see that we've actually eliminated 2 routes. So we've taken the stops from those and optimized those onto other routes to save on fuel and reduce the carbon footprint and ultimately potentially release those vehicles from our fleet.
Well, that's amazing because if you look at it, this is half a day's work. I'm saving around $1,400 a day doing this. So simple maths would suggest that implementing a relatively simple GIS, which I imagine you can do with a few lines of code, is going to save my business about $500,000 a year.
That's a great point, Simon. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks, Katie. So what we're going to do here is just kind of do some review. If you understand the benefits of GIS, there are many. It saves money. It provides for cost avoidance. It generates revenue, improves customer and citizen satisfaction. It manages our assets and resources, all of which are a business case for GIS. I guess from my perspective, something that everybody should consider is that GIS should be part of every manager's portfolio and trying to optimize their charter or their mission. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions, so I'm going to turn it over to Simon to take those.
All right, so Sarah in Arizona asks, this all seems very easy. I always thought you had to have a geography degree to do GIS. So what's changed? Well, this is one of the most common questions that we hear now, particularly in the commercial market, where we're seeing that the early emphasis of GIS was very much in information capture and management. But more and more, GIS has become a mainstream technology. It's adopted those enterprise standards, and it's actually been part of serving community to answer real questions, to provide answers that matter to people and solve business problems. And to do that, ESRI has changed the way many people think about GIS. We've been at the forefront of publishing and pushing information out there and trying to get information in the hands of decision makers. And as a consequence, we have adopted and embraced those IT standards and those open standards that we need to do that. And I think you'll see many of the products and the demonstrations we've actually shown today really demonstrate just how open and easy it is to now use GIS. And on a similar question, and the last one for today, Paul in Chicago asked, how does GIS integrate with other business systems that Chris described? And to do that, we use these common open standards that we talked about, the REST API, a JavaScript API, and other web service standards. This allows you to orchestrate very, very easily and share information using common systems, things that you're all familiar with as IT developers and the IT community. And so no longer do GIS professionals need to have specialized skills. They can actually adopt and incorporate the very technical skills that most of the organizations actually have.
Thanks, Simon. So before we go, we thought we'd point out a few resources to you. ESRI is dedicated to your education and continuing understanding of what GIS provides. We have a lot of web-based training, such as Getting Started with ArcGIS Business Analyst or Introduction to Arc Logistics Route. We have instructor-led training, such as the Introduction to ArcGIS Business Analyst and other products. We have numerous books that are discipline-specific and chock full of case studies. Measuring Up the Business Case for GIS shows examples of a variety of government and education and commercial applications and the return on investment that each of those organizations realized. We have books such as the GIS Tutorial for Marketing that actually steps you through how to use GIS in marketing. Now, there are several industry pages that talk to everything from commerce and education, agriculture, mining, law enforcement, that points to applications that are being used within those organizations and case studies that you can find from which to model your activities. One example would be the GIS Business Solutions page, which would be found under www.esri.com/business. Now, your comments help us improve our seminars. We ask you to please take a moment to complete our survey. Just click the Give Us Feedback link to take the survey. We hope you've enjoyed today's seminar. On behalf of ESRI, I'd like to thank you all for attending.